The Disappearance. On May 1st, 2001, a 24-year-old intern vanished from her apartment in the heart of Washington, D.C. Her name was Chandra Levy, a bright, ambitious woman from Modesto, California, who had come to the capital to chase the American dream. That morning, she logged onto her computer for the last time. Her email showed no distress, no warning. Then, silence. Days turned into weeks, and her name, once known only to friends and family, would soon echo through every corridor of power in the nation's capital. According to official records, Chandra had recently completed her internship with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. She was preparing to return home, excited about new job prospects, and making plans for the summer. Her apartment on DuPont Circle was neat and orderly. Her purse, credit cards, and identification were left behind. The only thing missing was her cell phone and Chandra. Her parents, Robert and Susan Levy, grew increasingly frantic when their daughter stopped calling. "Something's wrong," Susan told police. "She always checks in." The D.C. Metropolitan Police, accustomed to transient disappearances in the city, initially dismissed the urgency, but this case would not fade quietly. Within days, the name Chandra Levy would explode across national headlines, not because of what was known, but because of what was whispered. Investigators found that Chandra's computer history revealed a strange clue. The last websites she visited were related to Rock Creek Park, a vast stretch of wooded wilderness cutting through the center of Washington. It was the city's green lung, beautiful, but notorious for its crimes and disappearances. Detectives began searching the park, but the area was vast and unyielding. The trail went cold almost immediately. Friends described Chandra as optimistic, idealistic, and fiercely independent. She loved running, writing, and politics. She had fallen in love with Washington, the monuments, the energy, the sense of purpose that pulsed through the streets. But behind the glamour of the city's power, there was another world, one of ambition, secrets, and silence. And somewhere between those two worlds, Chandra Levy vanished. The story began to twist when whispers of a powerful man entered the conversation. A congressman, older, married, and connected. Rumors spread like wildfire through D.C. political circles. Who was he? What did he know? Why had he been calling her? And why did he refuse to talk? The nation watched as the story transformed from a missing person case into a political scandal. Cameras descended on Capitol Hill. Anchors speculated on love, betrayal, and murder. The city that built its fortune on power was suddenly consumed by one woman's disappearance, and by the uncomfortable question of how far power would go to protect itself. As weeks passed, hope faded. Flyers peeled from lampposts, vigils dimmed, and the Levy family stood alone against the machinery of indifference. "We just want her home," her father said quietly to reporters. But even then, deep inside the park where the shadows were thickest, Chandra was already there, waiting to be found. Her story had begun not as a crime, but as an ambition, and like so many ambitions in Washington, it was about to end in tragedy. Chandra Levy, the dreamer in D.C. Before she became a name whispered in headlines and conspiracy theories, Chandra Levy was simply a dreamer, a young woman from Modesto, California, who believed that the heart of her country beat in the marble corridors of Washington, D.C. She was 24, full of optimism, and convinced that she could build something meaningful in a world that often forgot the faces behind the headlines. Those who knew her say she carried the kind of curiosity that made people stop and listen. Sharp, funny, and energetic. Chandra was born in 1977, the daughter of a nurse and a doctor. Her parents, Susan and Robert Levy, raised her to believe that determination could open any door. She was the sort of student who filled her journals with plans, sketches, and fragments of poetry. In high school, she was driven by purpose. In college, that purpose became politics. She earned her degree in journalism from San Francisco State University and later pursued a master's in public administration at the University of Southern California. In late 2000, She landed an internship with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, a modest position, but to her, it was everything. She moved to D.C. alone, rented a small apartment near DuPont Circle, and began her new life in the city she had only seen on TV. To her friends back home, she wrote glowing letters about cherry blossoms, historic streets, and the thrill of being surrounded by people who actually make decisions that change things. Washington, to her, wasn't just a place, it was proof that ambition could be destiny. Colleagues remember her as confident yet kind. She wasn't just another intern, one coworker recalled. She asked real questions. She wanted to understand the system, not just work inside it. But Chandra was also young, impressionable, and navigating a city built on hierarchy. It was a place where smiles hid motives and where proximity to power could feel intoxicating. Somewhere amid that world of ambition and manipulation, she met a man who would change the course of her life. Friends would later say that Chandra had mentioned someone important, a man who was older, powerful, and not exactly available. She never gave his name, but her tone changed whenever she spoke of him. "He understands me," she told one friend. "He listens in a way nobody else does." What began as admiration slowly blurred into something more personal. The boundary between professional and private disappeared quietly, like fog over the Potomac. Washington has a way of turning secrets into currency, and for Chandra, secrecy became survival. Her life was divided between the public image of a promising young professional and the private reality of a forbidden relationship. Those close to her noticed a subtle change. She grew more guarded, more cautious about what she said and to whom. In her emails, she became vague about her personal life. Yet beneath the restraint, her optimism endured. "Things are looking up," she wrote to her parents weeks before she vanished. By the spring of 2001, her internship was ending. She had submitted her final reports, turned in her ID badge, and begun planning her return to California. Her lease was almost up, and she spoke to her father about coming home. "Just a few more days," she said. "I have some things to finish here." No one knew what those things were. Not her parents, not her friends, not even the people who would later spend years dissecting her final movements. In hindsight, those final weeks seemed filled with unspoken tension, as if she was standing at the edge of a decision she couldn't take back. The city that had once inspired her now felt heavy with eyes and whispers. The weather turned humid, thunderstorms rolled in, and the light in her apartment grew dim. The dreamer, who had come to Washington to make a difference, had unknowingly stepped into the machinery of power, scandal, and silence. Before long, that silence would consume her entirely. The secret connection. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder, and they all pointed in one direction, toward a congressman named Gary Condit, a respected Democrat from California, married, father of two, known for his charm and conservative composure. At first, the idea seemed absurd, but in Washington, absurdities often turn out to be truths that no one dares to confirm. Police questioned Condit early in the investigation. He admitted to knowing Chandra, but described their relationship as friendly. Yet, inconsistencies began to surface. Phone records revealed late-night calls, and her friends told investigators that she had confided in them about an affair with a powerful man from her home state, one who matched Condit's description. When the media caught wind of it, the story exploded. Headlines branded Condit as a suspect before any evidence could. "Congressman linked to missing intern," screamed every major outlet. For a man whose entire career had been built on image and discretion, it was political annihilation. Cameras followed him everywhere. His silence became its own confession. Behind closed doors, D.C. insiders whispered of meetings gone wrong, of promises made and broken. Police, under mounting pressure, began chasing shadows. They interviewed staffers, searched Condit's apartment, even dusted his watch for DNA. Nothing tied him to Chandra's disappearance, but the damage was already done. In the public eye, he was guilty of something far greater than crime: secrecy. The image of a congressman entangled with a young intern resurrected ghosts of earlier scandals. Another Washington cover-up, pundits said. Tabloids feasted on speculation. Late-night hosts mocked the city's moral hypocrisy. What began as a tragedy had become theater. For Chandra's parents, the spectacle was unbearable. They watched as their daughter's name became shorthand for scandal. "She's not a headline," Susan Levy told reporters through tears. "She's our child." But the machinery of fame had no mercy. Every revelation, every rumor, every denial became another twist in a national obsession that was no longer about finding the truth, but about feeding it. The investigation begins. Detectives were overwhelmed. In a city of power brokers and half-truths, even the simplest lead carried political weight. At first, the Metropolitan Police treated the case like a routine disappearance. By the time they realized it wasn't, weeks had already passed. Crucial evidence was gone, phone data overwritten, surveillance footage erased. In a city wired with cameras, there was no trace of Chandra Levy. Investigators combed her apartment again. They noted the treadmill clothes, the running shoes left neatly near the door, as if she'd planned to go jogging. The final clue on her computer, a search for directions to Rock Creek Park, seemed like a map drawn by fate. Officers scoured the park's hundreds of acres but found nothing. "It's like she disappeared into thin air," one detective said grimly. The FBI stepped in briefly but withdrew when politics clouded jurisdiction. Condit's lawyers blocked access to his phone records, citing privacy. Reporters leaked details faster than police could confirm them. Every misstep became national news. It was chaos, one officer admitted years later. "We weren't investigating, we were performing." Meanwhile, conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Some believed Chandra was silenced because she knew too much. Others suggested she ran away. Anonymous tips flooded the hotline, most useless, some cruel. Volunteers searched Rock Creek for months, but the park kept its secrets. Beneath the trees, the truth waited patiently, untouched by headlines or ambition. The media storm. By midsummer 2001, the case had mutated into a media hurricane. News anchors debated her love life on prime time. Politicians speculated in whispers. Editorials painted Chandra as both victim and temptress. It was the birth of a new kind of scandal, one fueled not by facts, but by voyeurism. Every detail of her private life was dissected, repackaged, and sold to a public addicted to tragedy. Television crews staked out Rock Creek Park, Capitol Hill, and even the Levy home in California. Neighbors were interviewed, co-workers harassed. Talk shows invited body language experts to interpret Condit's every blink. Late-night comedians turned grief into punchlines. In a culture hungry for spectacle, empathy was optional. Chandra's parents tried to redirect the focus. "Please," they pleaded on camera, "stop turning this into a circus. Help us find our daughter." But the plea only fueled more coverage. Ratings soared. The network executives called it America's mystery. When September 11th came, the nation's attention shifted overnight. The headlines vanished, replaced by horror on a global scale. But beneath that silence, Chandra's case lingered unresolved, a story frozen mid-sentence. It would be another year before the park that hid her would finally give her back. Gary Condit under fire. By mid-2001, Congressman Gary Condit's life had turned into a slow-motion collapse. The once respected lawmaker from California was now the most hated man in Washington, though no charges had ever been filed. The press labeled him the congressman with secrets. His silence became evidence, his composure interpreted as guilt. Reporters camped outside his home and office, hungry for a reaction. When he walked, they chased him. When he stayed inside, they speculated. His every word, gesture, and glance was dissected in headlines. Political analysts predicted his downfall, while comedians turned his scandal into late-night satire. To the American public, Condit wasn't a person anymore. He was a symbol of deceit. Inside the Capitol, allies vanished. Invitations were rescinded. Staffers resigned. Even his colleagues avoided eye contact in the hallways. The machinery of Washington, once his domain, now treated him like a contagion. The whispers grew darker, that he had used his influence to silence people, that there were missing phone records, that something about the timeline didn't add up. None of it proven, yet all of it fatal. Privately, Condit insisted he had nothing to do with Chandra's disappearance. In a rare interview, his voice trembled as he said, "I cared about her. I had nothing to do with what happened." But the words landed hollow. The more he denied, the more the public saw a man cornered by truth. The media didn't need a confession, they needed a villain. And they had found one, at home in Modesto. The Levy family watched his televised interviews in disbelief. "He knows something," Susan Levy said softly. "He has to." Her husband sat beside her, fists clenched, eyes wet. They wanted answers, not theater. But Washington had already turned their daughter's life into spectacle. By late summer, Condit's political career was over. His re-election campaign disintegrated. Former supporters distanced themselves publicly. "He's toxic," one campaign manager said bluntly. "It doesn't matter if he's innocent. The story's too big." Condit's name became shorthand for scandal, his once clean reputation destroyed by implication alone. Behind the scenes, investigators still lacked evidence. There was no crime scene, no weapon, no witness. Yet public pressure demanded a culprit. "We had to show progress," one former detective admitted years later. And Condit was the only thread anyone could pull. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate about mistakes, leads ignored, searches done too late, and evidence that had never been analyzed. Detectives privately criticized their own command structure. "Politics ruined this case," one officer said. "From day one, we were told what not to ask." Condit's downfall was complete by fall. He retreated from public view, replaced by a ghost of himself. "If you tell the truth and no one believes you," he said years later, "what else can you do but disappear?" In many ways, he mirrored the woman whose name had destroyed him, both swallowed by the same silence, both erased by the same system that thrives on rumor and fear. Washington had moved on, but beneath the surface, the unanswered questions still lingered. If not him, then who? The story had stopped being about truth long ago. It was now about narrative, about control. And in the city of control, the truth is always the first casualty. The silence of Rock Creek Park. By autumn, Rock Creek Park had become both a symbol and a graveyard of unanswered questions. It sprawled across the center of Washington like a green scar, quiet, ancient, and indifferent. The same park Chandra had searched online weeks before her disappearance now stood as the silent witness to her final hours. The police had searched it before, but only partially and without urgency. "We found nothing," one officer said then. "We thought she'd show up. She never did." In the cool mornings, joggers passed under the towering oaks, unaware that somewhere beyond the trails, the earth held a secret. The city carried on, traffic lights blinked, politics churned, and Washington's rhythm resumed. But the park never forgot. It waited. Detectives revisited the case files. Frustrated by dead ends, the park was over 1,700 acres, too vast to comb entirely. "You could hide 1,000 ghosts in there," a ranger once said. The first search teams were untrained volunteers, their routes uncoordinated, their efforts unrecorded. By the time professionals entered the scene, weeks had passed. Rains had fallen, and the evidence, whatever it had been, was gone. Still, Rock Creek remained the only real lead. If she went anywhere, an investigator said quietly, it was there. For months, the Levy family begged authorities to continue the search. They hired private investigators who walked the same trails, taking photos of shadows and stumps that looked like bones. "We feel her there," Susan Levy told reporters, her voice cracking. But public interest had waned. Without new developments, the cameras moved on. Tragedy without novelty is invisible in Washington. And yet, whispers about the park persisted. Some claimed they'd seen suspicious men lurking near the trails. Others spoke of abandoned camps, traces of violence, or eerie noises in the woods at night. None of it confirmed, all of it haunting. "It's a place where things go missing," one local said. "Not just people, memories." Officers patrolling the park found nothing substantial, but they couldn't shake the unease. The stillness felt oppressive, almost expectant. "You could feel her there," one of them admitted years later. Like the air was holding something back. As autumn turned to winter, the leaves buried whatever remained beneath them, and by then, even the hope of finding her alive had decayed. Washington continued to move forward, but the park stayed frozen in time, a perfect metaphor for the investigation itself. The leads had grown cold, the witnesses forgetful, the case officially stagnant. For a city that prided itself on control and order, Rock Creek Park was an open wound, an uncontrollable reminder that not everything could be explained or buried by press conferences. By early 2002, only her parents still spoke her name regularly. They drove from California to D.C. and walked the park's paths themselves, praying for a sign. "We just need to bring her home," her father said softly to the cameras. Behind them, the trees stood tall and silent, an audience to grief. They didn't know it then, but less than a mile away, hidden in the underbrush, the truth was waiting. Wind and rain had already done their work. The city had forgotten, but the earth had not. Rock Creek Park was silent, but silence in Washington often means someone is listening. Discovery of the remains, 2002. It was May 22, 2002, a humid morning in Washington, 1 year after Chandra Levy disappeared. A man walking his dog in Rock Creek Park stumbled upon what looked like a pale, curved stone beneath a bed of leaves. But it wasn't stone. It was a human skull. Within hours, police cordoned off the area. The site was deep within the woods, less than 100 yards from one of the main jogging trails, an area that had somehow been overlooked in earlier searches. Investigators descended on the scene with forensic teams, evidence markers, and grim silence. Reporters gathered outside the park's perimeter, whispering the same question. Was it her? The discovery made national news within minutes. Helicopters hovered overhead as yellow tape fluttered in the trees. Forensic specialists worked carefully, brushing away soil that had preserved more secrets than anyone imagined. They found skeletal remains, scraps of clothing, a jogging bra, tennis shoes, and a Walkman, the same model Chandra was known to use. Among the evidence was a small silver ring engraved with a pattern her mother instantly recognized. It was hers. For the Levy family, the news came with cruel duality, relief and devastation. "We finally know where she is," her father told reporters, his voice trembling. "But we'll never know why." The family flew to Washington the next morning. They visited the site, now covered with blue tarps and guarded by police, and left flowers at the base of a tree. The silence was unbearable. The air smelled of wet soil and old secrets. For investigators, the discovery reopened every question they thought had faded. How could they have missed this spot? Why had earlier searches failed? Who brought her here, and how? The coroner's report provided few answers. The remains were too decomposed for a definitive cause of death. Though trauma to the neck area suggested strangulation. Homicide, the official statement read. Manner, undetermined. The public demanded accountability. Former detectives were grilled on talk shows, their mistakes replayed in slow motion. "We searched that area," one insisted. "We just didn't go far enough." It was a bureaucratic failure written in tragedy. Proof that in Washington, even death could be mishandled. Gary Condit's name resurfaced instantly. Though no new evidence tied him to the crime, the headlines revived the scandal. "Her body found," one newspaper declared. Congressman Condit questioned again. Cameras returned to his doorstep like vultures. Once more, he denied involvement. Once more, the absence of proof became its own curse. Every time they mention her, he said, years later, "They mention me." Inside police headquarters, The mood was grim. They had a body, but no weapon, no suspect, no timeline. The park had devoured a year's worth of potential evidence. Rain, animals, and decay had erased everything but bone. What remained was symbolic more than forensic, a skeleton of truth with its flesh torn away by time and politics. In California, the Levys buried their daughter in a small ceremony. No cameras were allowed. Friends and family gathered in silence as the rabbi spoke. Justice is not closure. Justice is remembrance. Her mother wept quietly, clutching the ring that had survived when everything else did not. For the rest of the country, the story was both ending and beginning. The discovery reignited the national obsession. Documentaries, headlines, conspiracy theories. The mystery had returned, darker and deeper than before. And somewhere in Rock Creek Park, under the same indifferent sky, the truth still lingered, waiting for someone brave enough to dig deeper. What was found that day wasn't just the remains of a young woman. It was the buried conscience of a city that had moved on too quickly, forgetting that silence, too, leaves evidence. The public reaction. When the news broke that Chandra Levy's remains had been found, America erupted once again. After a year of rumors, silence, and speculation, the mystery was no longer abstract. It had a body. But instead of closure, the discovery only deepened the wound. Across the country, people felt both sadness and anger. Sadness for the young woman whose dreams had ended in a forest, and anger at the failures that allowed it to happen. In Modesto, California, the Levy home became a shrine. Neighbors brought flowers and letters. Candles burned through the night on their porch. Reporters gathered outside, their vans lined along the curb, waiting for any statement from the grieving family. Inside, Susan and Robert Levy sat in their living room, surrounded by boxes of clippings and unanswered questions. "We trusted the system," Susan said quietly to a local station, but the system forgot her. In Washington, public reaction was split between outrage and resignation. Citizens demanded accountability from the police. Editorials condemned the D.C. Metropolitan Department for its early negligence. "If this had been someone connected to the elite," one columnist wrote, "would they have searched harder?" For many, the case symbolized the indifference of institutions meant to protect. "They let the story become about a politician," another journalist said, and forgot it was about a girl. Talk shows reignited the frenzy. Psychologists, criminologists, and self-proclaimed experts debated motives and suspects. Political analysts wondered what the case revealed about power and morality in the Capitol. Every opinion was presented as fact. The lines between truth and entertainment blurred once again. Even in death, Chandra's story was being consumed, packaged, dramatized, monetized. Gary Condit, now a pariah, faced renewed torment. Though cleared of any criminal connection, his career was finished. Protesters shouted outside his office, demanding confession. "I've told the truth." He repeated in every interview, his voice flat and tired, but no one believed him anymore. Public perception had already rendered its verdict, guilt by association. Meanwhile, police promised renewed effort. "This is now a homicide investigation," the spokesperson declared at a press conference. Yet few trusted those words. Investigators seemed to chase their own tails, revisiting old files, chasing irrelevant leads. The department's credibility was in ruins. Even the mayor called for outside review. "The people of Washington deserve better," he said, though few believed that either. For Chandra's friends, grief came mixed with guilt. They replayed old conversations, searching for signs they'd missed. One friend remembered her saying, "Sometimes I feel invisible in this city." The words, once casual, now felt prophetic. Her invisibility had become complete. The public, too, began to turn inward. The case had struck a nerve deeper than celebrity scandal. It was about fear, the idea that even in the capital of the free world, a young woman could vanish and no one would care until it was too late. It exposed something raw about America's obsession with image, status, and power, and how easily human life gets lost beneath them. The Levys refused to let her memory fade. They organized foundations in her name, pushing for missing person reforms and greater accountability in law enforcement. "This can't happen again," her father said at a vigil in D.C., holding a candle as dusk fell over the park that had swallowed his daughter. Someone has to learn from this, but deep down everyone knew Washington doesn't learn. It forgets. It moves on. By winter, the case had become history to most Americans. The cameras left. The vigils stopped. Only the family and a few journalists still asked questions. Somewhere in the city that runs on secrets, someone was still sleeping peacefully. Someone who knew exactly what happened in Rock Creek Park. And as the years would show, even truth itself would become another victim. Ingmar Guandique, the perfect scapegoat. By 2009, the case had long gone cold. Years had passed since Chandra Levy's body was found, and the nation had moved on. But inside a DC police archive, a dusty file still waited, unsolved, unresolved, unfinished. Then, almost out of nowhere, a name resurfaced: Ingmar Guandique. Guandique was a Salvadoran immigrant serving time for attacking 2 female joggers in Rock Creek Park, around the same period Chandra vanished. He was small, wiry, and quiet, the kind of man society forgets. His crimes were brutal but non-fatal. He stalked women in the park, ambushed them, and fled. When detectives revisited his record, it seemed almost too convenient. A man with a history of violence, already in prison, and with no one to defend him. The perfect suspect, the perfect scapegoat. Under mounting pressure to close the case, investigators reopened the Levy file. The new theory was simple. Guandique had attacked Chandra while she was jogging, killed her, and left her body hidden in the woods. There were no witnesses, no DNA, no physical evidence, only a connection in geography and timing. But in Washington, optics often matter more than truth. Prosecutors built their case on circumstantial whispers. They relied heavily on the testimony of a jailhouse informant who claimed that Guandique had confessed to the murder. The man, a known manipulator, had traded information before in exchange for reduced sentences. Still, his story fit what the public wanted to hear. "He told me he grabbed her. She screamed, and he panicked," the informant said. It was cinematic and entirely unverifiable. The Levy family, desperate for closure, supported the indictment. "We want justice," Robert Levy said, his voice steady but hollow. Few blamed him. After years of waiting, any answer felt better than none. The media returned, eager for a sequel. Headlines read, "Justice for Chandra." Cable networks revived the old footage, looping the same images of Rock Creek Park and Condit's face, now aged and irrelevant. Guandique, confused and terrified, denied everything. "I didn't kill her," he told his public defender. "I never saw her." But his accent, his record, and his immigrant status made him an easy villain for the public imagination. "The story writes itself," one journalist admitted. "A foreign predator in the heart of America's capital. It sells." The prosecution's case was shaky at best. They had no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses, not even a clear cause of death. But they had narrative momentum. "The jury wanted to believe someone was paying for this," said a court observer. It didn't matter if it was the right person. When the verdict came in 2010, guilty, the courtroom erupted. Reporters tweeted live reactions. "Justice at last," one network declared. The Levys wept quietly, holding hands. For them, the moment was bittersweet. "We can finally grieve," Susan Levy said. But outside the courthouse, voices of doubt began to whisper. Some journalists noted that the evidence was paper-thin. The jailhouse witness had lied in other cases. Key testimony had changed multiple times. And the defense had been barred from introducing information about Condit's alleged relationship with Chandra, a move that smelled of political protection. It was a conviction of convenience, one legal analyst said. A solution, not a truth. Still, for a brief moment, Washington breathed easier. A case that had haunted the city for nearly a decade was closed. The headlines faded, and the public turned the page. But as history would soon reveal, the truth had not been buried with Chandra. It was buried with the verdict. Because in Washington, justice is never about what happened. It's about what needs to be believed. The Trial and Conviction, 2010. The trial of Ingmar Gwandike began in October 2010, almost a decade after Chandra Levy's disappearance. By then, most of the world had moved on, but in Washington, ghosts never really fade. The courtroom in the D.C. Superior Court was packed with reporters, victims' advocates, and curious spectators. It was less about the facts and more about theater, a ritualized attempt to turn speculation into justice. The prosecution's case rested on air. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses. What they had was a story, one stitched together from fear, pressure, and politics. Their key witness, the jailhouse informant, testified again with an almost cinematic flair. "He told me he killed her," the man declared, eyes darting between the jury and the cameras. When asked how Gwandike supposedly did it, his account shifted mid-sentence. But no one seemed to notice or care. The defense argued that Gwandike was a convenient target, framed by the city's desperation to close an embarrassing case. "There is no evidence tying my client to Miss Levy," his lawyer said in closing arguments. "This is not justice. This is scapegoating." But her voice was drowned beneath the noise of politics and public expectation. After years of headlines, the jury had already absorbed the narrative. Someone had to pay. Throughout the trial, Gwandike sat quietly, often with his head down. He didn't understand much English, and translators whispered the proceedings to him like a tragic lullaby. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, he showed little reaction. Maybe he expected it. Maybe he knew that truth had no place here anymore. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as the Levy family faced the microphones. "We finally have justice," Susan Levy said softly, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion rather than relief. The public cheered the verdict. Politicians congratulated law enforcement. "We never gave up," said the D.C. chief of police, smiling for the cameras. But inside the justice system, cracks were already forming. Behind the scenes, prosecutors and detectives privately admitted their doubts. "It's not perfect," one said, "but it's something." Another confessed that political pressure had driven the case forward faster than it should have. "Everyone wanted closure," he said, and closure became more important than truth. The words would echo for years. In the months following the verdict, Gwandike was sentenced to 60 years in prison. For many Americans, the case ended there, another tragedy wrapped neatly in legal procedure. But for those who looked closer, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. The prosecution's timeline didn't match witness accounts. The evidence handling was sloppy, and the star witness, the one who claimed Gwandike had confessed, had a documented history of lying to law enforcement for personal gain. Still, the machine of justice marched forward. The public wanted finality, not uncertainty. News anchors spoke of resolution. Editorials praised tenacity. And once again, Washington congratulated itself for cleaning up a mess of its own making. The system had delivered what it always does, a performance of truth. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. A new generation of reporters began revisiting the case, comparing documents, uncovering contradictions. They noticed how conveniently the investigation had changed direction from a political scandal to an immigrant narrative. They began to ask dangerous questions. Who benefited from this version of the story? Who made sure it stuck? As one veteran journalist put it, the case was never solved. It was simply satisfied. For the Levy family, the verdict brought quiet, but not peace. "Justice feels hollow," Robert Levy admitted later. "It's not supposed to feel like this." And for the city of Washington, D.C., the trial was more than an ending. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth that power prefers to forget. In the capital of democracy, even justice can be staged. The retraction and release, 2016. In 2016, the truth finally began to claw its way back from the depths of Washington's silence. 15 years after Chandra Levy's disappearance, the conviction that was meant to close the case began to crumble. What had once been presented as justice was now revealed as illusion. The cracks in the narrative widened, and the system that once claimed victory found itself on trial. It began quietly, a small motion filed by Guandique's defense team. They had discovered that the government's star witness, the jailhouse informant, had lied. He had fabricated testimony in multiple cases, and prosecutors knew it. The very foundation of the conviction, the supposed confession, was rotten. Slowly, the dominoes began to fall. The Washington Post published an investigative series exposing the misconduct, revealing how the D.C. prosecutors had withheld exculpatory evidence. What had been called closure now looked like corruption. The court granted a retrial. For the first time in years, Guandique saw daylight through the bars. His lawyers presented new evidence showing inconsistencies, mismanagement, and outright deception. He was an easy target, one of them told the press. He was poor, foreign, and invisible. They needed a villain, and he fit the script. Even the prosecutors who once defended the case began to step back. Mistakes were made, one admitted, but we acted in good faith. The words rang hollow, as they always do in Washington. After months of hearings, the U.S. Attorney's Office dropped all charges. The government will not retry this case, the statement read. There is no longer sufficient evidence. Guandique was released and deported shortly after, a free man in name only. He returned to El Salvador, where reporters found him years later, living in obscurity. "They ruined my life," he said. "I lost everything for something I didn't do. For the Levy family, the news reopened old wounds. We wanted truth, not this," Susan Levy said in an interview. "If he didn't do it, then who did? Are we back to nothing?" The grief had aged them, carved into their voices. They had spent 15 years chasing justice, only to find that justice had been chasing headlines. "They lied to us," Robert Levy added. "They lied to everyone." Public reaction was mixed, part outrage, part indifference. The same media that once declared justice for Chandra now published quiet retractions buried beneath election coverage. Talk shows avoided the topic. There was no spectacle in self-reflection. Washington does not apologize, it rewrites. The case had been too convenient to question and too embarrassing to revisit. For investigators, the reversal was humiliating. Files were reopened, and internal reviews revealed systemic failures. Evidence mishandled, leads ignored, timelines altered to fit a predetermined story. The truth didn't fit the narrative, one retired officer confessed. So they built a new one. The retrial that never happened exposed a deeper problem. Not just one case gone wrong, but a culture of optics over accuracy. The Levy case had been an experiment in media-driven justice, a morality play for a restless nation. And when the curtain finally fell, no one clapped. Ingmar Guandique's name faded from memory, just as Chandra's had years earlier. The city moved on once again, burying the embarrassment beneath new scandals, new wars, new headlines. But for those who remembered, the question still lingered. If not him, then who? In the end, Washington got what it always wanted, an ending. Not the right one, not the true one, but one that allowed it to sleep at night. And somewhere in Rock Creek Park, the silence began again. The media's guilt. Long after the courtrooms emptied and the headlines faded, the media still carried the ghost of Chandra Levy, not as a memory, but as a mirror. What began as a missing persons case had evolved into a national obsession, and behind every breaking news banner was a newsroom that knew exactly what it was doing. The story was not just reported, it was manufactured. In 2001, cable television was in its golden age of sensationalism. The 24-hour news cycle demanded constant fuel, and Chandra's story provided it in abundance. A young woman, political intrigue. A powerful man, and the promise of scandal. It was everything a producer could ask for. Her face became the nation's wallpaper. Her life dissected by strangers who never said her name with respect, only curiosity. Missing intern, D.C. affair, Capitol scandal. The words became brands, not descriptors. Editors chased the story, not because they cared about justice, but because it delivered ratings. Talk show hosts spoke of morality between commercial breaks. We were feeding a machine, one former anchor admitted years later. It didn't matter if it was true. It just had to keep people watching. What was lost in that feeding frenzy was the humanity of a young woman who had come to Washington simply to learn, to grow, to matter. When Chandra's body was found, the cameras came back like scavengers. They filmed her parents crying, replayed their sound bites, and cut away to pundits speculating about guilt and redemption. Each segment ended with polished graphics and ominous music. Every tragedy had to be cinematic, and Chandra's was no exception. We turned her death into a serial drama. One journalist confessed. We gave the audience a villain, a plot twist, and an ending, even if none of it was real. Gary Condit became the convenient face of that fiction. The media built him up as a symbol of corruption and secrecy, then tore him apart. When the real suspect appeared years later, those same networks barely covered it. The truth was no longer interesting. We already had our story, said another reporter. Changing it would have meant admitting we were wrong. The cost of that negligence went far beyond Condit's career. It shaped public perception, poisoned investigations, and destroyed the lives of people who had nothing to do with the crime. It also robbed Chandra of her dignity. She became a headline, not a person. Even her achievements, her degrees, her ambition, vanished beneath the tabloid fog. She was rewritten as a plot device in someone else's downfall. The media never apologized. They moved on to the next tragedy, the next scandal, the next story that could keep viewers staring just a little longer. And yet, every time a new case of a missing woman appeared, echoes of Chandra's story returned. The same framing, the same voyeurism, the same exploitation of pain dressed up as empathy. We didn't learn. One veteran reporter admitted, "We just upgraded the graphics." Years later, documentaries tried to correct the record, to humanize what had been dehumanized. But even those retrospectives carried the same haunting irony, the same industry profiting, once more from the story it had already consumed. "Every retelling is another desecration," wrote one critic. "We say we're honoring her, but really, we're keeping her ghost on camera." In the end, the media's guilt is not about lies told, but truths ignored. The truth that she was more than a scandal. A truth that her death revealed the rot beneath the surface of the institutions America trusts most, the press, the police, and the politicians. All had failed her, yet all had profited from her. And so, even now, when her name appears in old archives or late-night reruns, it carries a strange weight, not of remembrance, but of regret. Because for Chandra Levy, the real injustice wasn't just what happened in the park. It was what happened after. The ghost of Washington. Washington, D.C. is a city built on memory and on forgetting. Its marble monuments promise permanence, yet its politics thrive on amnesia. Power changes hands, scandals fade, and the city exhales. But some stories refuse to dissolve. Chandra Levy's is one of them. Her name lingers like the echo of a question that no one wants to answer. Walk the streets near DuPont Circle, where she once lived, and you can still feel it, the strange tension between innocence and intrigue. The same air that carries the scent of cherry blossoms also carries the ghosts of ambition and betrayal. Every block of this city is haunted, not by the supernatural, but by the human cost of power, and Chandra's ghost walks among them. For those who knew her, the city remains a place of unfinished conversations. A friend once said, "She loved Washington too much to see what it really was." To Chandra, the capital represented opportunity, a place where effort mattered, where ideals could be transformed into action. But the Washington she walked into was not the one she had dreamed of. Behind every handshake was calculation, behind every promise, compromise. The closer she got to influence, the more invisible she became. Over the years, the park where her body was found became less a crime scene and more a symbol. Visitors come and go, some unaware of the history beneath their feet. Others stop, whisper her name, and move on. The trees have grown thicker, the soil darker, but the silence remains. It is said that nature reclaims everything eventually, even memory. Yet somehow, the story refuses to rest. "She's still there," one park ranger said quietly. not her body, her presence. Washington has always been a city of ghosts, of unkept promises, of lost lives buried beneath headlines. The men who built its monuments wanted to immortalize ideals, but they also built walls high enough to hide the failures behind them. Chandra's case revealed one such failure, not just of justice, but of empathy. Her disappearance exposed how quickly the powerful retreat behind silence when the truth threatens their comfort. For years, officials spoke her name only when convenient. Committees referenced her tragedy in hearings about reform. Police chiefs cited her case when discussing resource shortages. Journalists invoked her story as cautionary metaphor. Everyone found a way to use her. No one found a way to honor her. If you stand near the entrance of Rock Creek Park at dusk, you can hear the hum of the city in the distance, the traffic, the faint sirens, the endless pulse of movement. The park feels disconnected from all of it, as though time itself slows there. The light dims, and the forest begins to whisper. The wind moves through the trees like breath through a cathedral. It's not hard to imagine her there, running the same trails she once searched online, unaware that she was stepping into history. Her ghost is not vengeful, it's weary. It watches the city carry on, another administration, another scandal, another generation that doesn't remember. It watches the cameras move to new tragedies, the same pattern repeated endlessly. Outrage, speculation, silence, and still, the truth remains buried somewhere beneath the leaves. Chandra Levy's story is not unique in Washington. It's part of a long tradition of people devoured by the systems they believed in. The city's beauty lies in its contradictions, its capacity for idealism, and its appetite for destruction. She came to serve it. It consumed her instead. Years later, one investigator said, "This case taught me something. Washington doesn't kill you with bullets, it kills you with indifference." Those words ring truer than any confession ever could. The ghost of Washington is not Chandra. It's the silence that followed her. And so the Capitol stands, gleaming marble by day, shadowed corridors by night, a place where truth and myth walk hand in hand. Somewhere within that quiet, Chandra Levy still exists, not as a headline or a scandal, but as a reminder that power always leaves a body behind. Epilogue. Justice in the shadows. Time has a way of polishing tragedy into myth, and like all myths, the story of Chandra Levy now lives somewhere between truth and memory, reshaped by repetition, softened by distance. Her case no longer dominates headlines, but it never really disappeared. It lingers in the spaces between facts, in the unanswered questions, the missing files, the quiet acknowledgement that Washington's justice is a performance, not a promise. 15 years after her death, the park where her remains were found remains deceptively calm. Joggers pass without looking down. Children play where search teams once dug through soil and bone. There's no marker, no plaque, no sign to tell them that this ground once held the center of a national storm. The silence feels almost deliberate, as if the city itself is trying to forget. But memory has a way of surviving even the most meticulous cover-up. Every few years, a journalist revisits the case, tracing the same familiar paths. The timeline, the affair, the failed investigation, the wrongful conviction. Each retelling uncovers fragments of truth that never quite fit together. And every time the story resurfaces, it feels less like a crime and more like a confession. Not of one man's guilt, but of a system's. Chandra's story was supposed to be about justice. Instead, it became a study in power, how it hides, how it manipulates, how it survives. No one was ever truly held accountable for the failures that cost her life. The police department issued statements of regret. The prosecutors who built their case on false testimony were promoted. The networks that exploited her death for ratings went on to do it again with new victims. New faces, new families. The cycle never ended, it just changed names. Somewhere in that cycle lies the truth that Washington refuses to say aloud. Justice, in this city, is selective. It shines brightly on the powerful and dims for everyone else. It is a spotlight, not a torch. It doesn't illuminate, it blinds. For the Levy family, the years that followed were defined by endurance. They became advocates for missing persons, speaking at vigils and reform panels, refusing to let their daughter's name fade into history's background noise. "We can't bring her back," Susan Levy once said, "but we can make sure no one else disappears the way she did." Yet even in her advocacy, there was exhaustion, the heavy burden of carrying a story that never ended, of living in a narrative that refused to give closure. In 2021, 2 decades after her death, a quiet ceremony was held in her hometown. There were no cameras, no statements, just a few people who still remembered her laughter. A friend placed a single white rose beside her headstone and whispered, "You deserved better." The wind caught the words and carried them somewhere far beyond the small California cemetery, perhaps all the way back to Washington, where truth still hides behind polished doors. Every era has its cautionary tales, and Chandra's became one of America's. Not just for what happened to her, but for how the country reacted, how it turned her life into a spectacle, her death into a commodity, and her story into an echo. She was not the first, and she will not be the last, to vanish into the machinery of media and power. But she remains the reminder that every system that feeds on attention eventually forgets compassion. In the final accounting, there are no villains left, only ghosts. A young woman silenced before her life began. A congressman destroyed by implication. A convict branded forever by lies. A city that built its reputation on ideals and buried them under convenience. They are all casualties of the same truth, that justice, when filtered through politics, becomes something else entirely. And so, as night falls over Washington, the monuments glow with artificial light, cold, unwavering, eternal. Somewhere beyond them, in the quiet woods of Rock Creek Park, the shadows stretch long. The wind whispers through the trees, and for a fleeting moment, it almost sounds like a name. A name the city once knew, a name it tried to forget, but never could. Chandra Levy. She came to Washington seeking purpose. She found power's reflection instead. And in that reflection, America saw itself.